let me know when you're all connected.
Yeah.
Yep, I can
Yeah.
see you totally
Can you see
clearly.
me okay? I'm just realizing. Great.
Well, it is a
Wonderful.
pleasure to talk to
It's so good
you.
to be with you.
I am such a fan of the work you're
Likewise.
doing and the way you integrate
Mm,
research and clinical work, and you write so beautifully. So I,
oh, thank
I
you.
want to give you the chance to introduce yourself to everyone who's read your work, but is there
Mm.
anything that you would like people to know about you? I'm happy to say what I know about you, but you're the expert here.
Oh, 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 thank you so much for that invitation. It's funny whenever I'm asked to introduce myself, there's so many different ways or facets that I could do that. And I think in this context, it's helpful to address that I'm a registered psychologist and an author, and that a lot of my clinical and research work focuses on trauma and embodiment and the relationship between the two and healing and kind of all of the things that go along with that. I think I also it can be helpful when talking about my position as an expert to also talk about my humanness. I kind of in that vein to really demystify the stuff behind the role. And so I come to you also as someone who has experiences of trauma in my body and lived with an eating disorder for a number of years and found that, yeah, that was really the impetus to understand embodiment and a new way of relating to my body because what was being proposed to me, treatment wasn't working for me. And what else is useful? I live with chronic pain. Yeah, and I think maybe just as important as all of those things is that I love being alive and I love being a body and I love helping people learn that their body doesn't hate them, that we can be in relationship with our bodies, and that that's actually a very central component to understanding not only the phenomenology of our lived experience, but mental health and connection and attachment and emotion regulation. And the body is the place where it all happens. And I understand from my own
Yeah.
slice some of
And
why it's hard
I
to be
want
a
to
body.
briefly tell you a little bit about the book club, but before we do that, I want to thank you.
Hmm.
As a psychologist myself, one of the best things about this book club is reading about things that I know in theory, but don't spend a ton of time necessarily, you know, thinking about in my day-to-day life. And if I do, it's as a psychologist, as a researcher, as a therapist, and not, for myself. And I am also someone who's had multiple pretty serious car accidents and had to deal with the physical ramifications of that. And then while reading your book, potentially developed, I'm still waiting for some MRI results, but a stress fracture, which would have been my sixth stress fracture in the past
Mm.
4 years. And just, it sounds so silly to say because it's something I
Okay.
should know, but, reading your words helped me, with that frustration of not being
Oh.
able to move my body in the way that I'm used to, and
Hmm.
helped me remind myself to be grateful for what my body is capable of doing amidst the frustration of injuries or pain. So thank you for that.
Mm. I'm so glad that in outside of the professional roles that we both hold, that we could be connected on that very human
So,
experience of pain together.
so this
Thanks for
book
letting me
club
know that. Mm.
is something that I created a little over a year ago, um, coming from
Mhm.
some feelings of, so I started this Instagram account um, basically with the blanket offer to help anyone find therapists because, as you know, it's hard. Waiting lists are extremely long. For people who need to be in network, that's extremely hard to find. And most people don't even know where to start. And finding, admitting you need help or recognizing that you want to start therapy is scary and intimidating. And so kind of made this offer to help people. And along with the responses I got were a lot of people saying that they might not necessarily feel ready for therapy, but wanted to be pointed to some kind of resources that might help them start to process whatever they were going through. And so the book club came out of this. So every
Mhm.
month, it's a pleasure. We have expanded to not just reading books written by therapists or psychologists, but anyone related to anything in the mental health field. So that could be someone who's attended therapy. That could be, just a totally diverse realm. But your book
Yeah,
encompasses so much
incredible.
and, touches on topics that we haven't necessarily covered, but really blends in well. And so I say that to say that the
Mm.
members of the book club, who are either maybe here or will be, tuning into the replay later, come to the book club with all different types of backgrounds in terms of either what they've endured or what their prior knowledge and understanding of different facets of the mental health field are.
Great. That's really helpful to know. And when responding
I
to
want to
questions,
start by,
mhm.
you define it so well, but just briefly, and I know it's not a brief answer, can you define embodiment and disembodiment for people who might want more
Sure,
clarity on that because it's so
sure.
central to the conversation?
Oh my gosh. Yes, absolutely. Well, I think that, embodiment is more and more these days in our cultural vocabularies. We have a sense of understanding, I think probably more about trauma healing, and there's just more language available to us connected to mental health and our experiences. So the way that I define embodiment, which might be different than how other people use it, is that it's the lived experience of engaging with the world as a body from the positionality of being a body, not just a mind that has a body, and not just a body in isolation, but actually a body in a social fabric, in a context, a cultural context where we have stories about who's valuable and who's not, and how certain bodies access space or treatment or are desired. And so our bodies and how we feel about being a body, how we feel about being us, is both about what it's been like to be us, but also what it's been like to be us in context of these social constructs. So embodiment, the way that we look at it clinically and empirically, is experience. And experience includes this whole range of qualities and dynamics, ranging from what we might call like negative, and what that might, the language we might put around that would be disembodiment. So kind of misattunement and maybe a silencing of bodily cues, and to all the, all the way to the extent of feeling dissociated and not actually knowing that we, feeling that we have a body. On the other spectrum, end of the spectrum, we might say that positive embodiment, or maybe the way that I'm talking about just embodiment in general, is the felt sense of attunement to a body, this connection to our cues, a wanting to honor and care for ourselves as a body, a recognition that we are a body, not just a mind that has a body that carries it around, and the ability to enjoy and feel pleasure and sense from the inside out, kind of interocept our way through the world. Now, when I talk about embodiment in that way, as kind of clinically or empirically as having that whole spectrum, I would say that most of us are at varying points of the spectrum throughout the day. And that the goal of positive embodiment, or maybe kind of the thrust of my work, is not that we are perfectly attuned and totally in pleasure and agency and bodily autonomy all the time, but rather, can we recognize where we are? Can we understand that where we shift is also a product of what contexts we're in? And are there things that we can do to increase our bodily attunement and agency and ownership and felt sense of pleasure, so that our quality of life increases? And so we have more of a sense of being in our skin, instead of maybe feeling like we are subject to the social conditions that leave us feeling disempowered or alienated from other
I
people
think
or from
that's a
ourselves.
great way to describe it. And one thing, I appreciate so much about the book
Mm.
is that it touches on body image, it touches on trauma, but it, also, and those things are so important, but it covers such diverse topics. And I think, the discussion
Mm.
about colonialism and racism and sexism and ableism and all those isms is so important because I think that it's something that doesn't necessarily get discussed enough in
Mm.
relation to how people view themselves in their bodies, and it's something that and I say that as a
Hmm.
cisgender white woman, so it's, I'm speaking from my experience and can't speak for other people's, but I think it's so important to cover. And, it's the part that you wrote about with, how wheelchairs can empower people and provide them freedom rather than seen as something that's restrictive. I think is just such a good reminder, because I think it's so easy to fall into these assumptions about how people feel within their body, and not necessarily take the perspective of how someone might see what their body is or isn't able to do and how they feel about that. And I think that that's important.
Mm. Yeah, thank you so much for naming that. Yeah, I think the conversation
Yeah,
about power and politics as it comes to the body is so important because often when we think about the body, it's really easy, unless we are at the intersections of identity and culture in which our bodily experience has
yeah,
left us feeling on the outside of power or marginalized in some way, it may not be that we think about our body as
right.
connected to politics, especially, again, as I'm saying this, especially in ways that we
Yeah,
perhaps benefit from how privilege and power are conferred in our society. And so remembering, oh, our body, like even how I feel about myself is connected to what's happening around
yeah,
me. Like that can be a little bit mind blowing and sometimes liberating to realize like, oh, that this there is a
yeah,
social piece going on in terms of how I experience myself, which in itself is, I think, it would be my hope that that would be kind of a decolonial, decolonizing thought to realize
yeah,
that our individualism, even in our felt sense of our own mental health, is a product of a fragmented cultural imagination, and that actually we are all interconnected
yeah.
in ways that are meaningful, including at the root
Yeah,
of so much of our
and
suffering and our pain.
in more obvious and very, very relevant ways, your discussion of how um, people who are, have less social status because of their bodies and less control because of their bodies, how they, I'm trying to think about how to articulate this well, how, people who don't necessarily define themselves by their bodies because they have higher social status are often making decisions um, on behalf of, or
Right.
that most affect, those who are defined by their bodies and have, less status because of that, is, I think, so important to discuss, because it's
Mhm.
something that in some way or another affects all of us, and I think is so important when thinking about how people think of their bodies, right? And it's
Yeah.
not just about appearance; it's about the way that people are oppressed because of who they are and,
Mm.
how they're born and all of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's an interesting argument to be made here about power and privilege and embodiment as it relates to the people who think that they need disembodied the people who think that they need embodiment work the least are often the people who
Yeah,
have benefited from being disembodied and are kind of at the higher on the rung of how power is stratified socially. And what I would love, if you
yeah,
were to ask me what I would want for this book, I would want for this book to get into the
yeah,
hands of people who've never heard of the word embodiment, who have never really even thought about what it means to be a body, and how thinking about being a body and how thinking about being a body in a social context actually matters and shapes their lived experience. Because my hope is that then these people who've never really thought about it would start thinking about it, and they could bring that into the spaces where
yeah,
they have power because of their disembodiment. So I think that there's just something really important about this being for everybody, right?
yeah,
That it's for the people who have benefited from their disembodiment. And I think it also ultimately is, as I say this as a trauma specialist too, is for folks who have had to become disembodied as a means of
yeah,
surviving their trauma, right? That it gets to be for everybody across the spectrum of power and marginalization, and that because bodies are kind of the substrate of our human experience, we can all encounter our bodies in new and more meaningful ways
Yeah.
that enrich our lives and our
And
connections
this
with each
is
other.
perhaps a large question, to answer in a short period of time,
Mm.
because so much of this does feel like more of a societal problem than an individual problem. But what are steps that we as individuals can take to start
Mm.
combating uh, the
Yeah.
ways that that those who are defined by their bodies are also oppressed by their bodies because of society?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple things that come to mind. And again, there are people who I would say, depending on their social location and the way that they're
Yeah,
marginalized, would actually be able to speak to this more acutely than I would based on my positionality. But I can say, kind of broadly speaking, I think that reflecting on the areas where we on the and the ways that we
yeah,
do not think about our body, the way that we do not have to think about our body, clues us into something about a different version of existence that might be out there, that might be foreign to us. So again, I'm reminded of, I think I tell this story in the book too, of my experience of having injury and going, oh, I didn't think I had to walk. I didn't realize that I walked up the stairs to get to my office every day. I didn't think about it because it wasn't part of my embodied experience to need a mobility aid or an elevator. And there's something about realizing that I didn't have to think about the stairs that made me realize, oh, there's something here that actually should be thought about. So whenever we are experiencing something in our body, asking ourselves, like, what am I not having to be
yeah,
reflective about because it's normative for me, and what does that tell me about my experience in the world? But then I think that this might be maybe even a bit more practical and tangible for us. I think emotion regulation is actually at the center of a lot of these conversations, because it's really hard to shift culture if we can't tolerate our own distress around, when hearing people's anger about how, we have benefited from power systems that have hurt somebody else. So let's just say, I'll position myself as a white woman as I say this, like, the more comfortable I am with my own pain and my own anger, and the better able I am to tolerate what those feel like inside of me, the less I need to defend against somebody else's anger or pain when they're expressing what it's like to be a body in our culture. The less I need to say, no, 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 but have you seen my pain? Or, oh, no, I didn't, right, to
yeah,
disqualify, what they're saying and excuse myself from something. So I think that when we can, particularly as it relates to positions of power, when we can be with our emotion and feel it in our body and have looked at what we don't really want to look at in our own stories and tolerate the intensity of that, it makes it much easier to think about, okay, what's needed to change culture? Because we can actually answer that question based on what is needed,
yeah,
as opposed to
yeah,
what can I tolerate, or what do I
yeah.
not want to avoid, or,
And
things like that.
to add one question to this discussion about society's influence on how we feel in our bodies and how we identify ourselves. One person wrote in saying, I'm beginning to wonder how much of my trans desires and feelings, specifically discomfort associated with feminism or identifying with my assigned sex of female, stem from my experience and witnessing of the systemic oppression of females in most of the world. Do you think it's possible for transness to be mostly a reaction to an oppressive gender binary instead of an inherent quality of being? I think is, a complicated question, but
Mm.
do you have any thoughts in response to that?
Hmm. Yeah, certainly I can say in my clinical practice, like, not from my own lived experience, but what I've encountered as I've been with people as they explore, some people, not all trans folks, as they explore what this is about for them, we can see that there is something about the rigidity around the socialization into womanhood, and the restrictive, and scholar Neva Paran calls this kind of the corseting of the body,
Yeah,
like how inhumane that is. And I think on some level, it's a very healthy and appropriate
yeah,
reaction to say, I don't want any part of that, right? I think that there are number of options of how we can resist. And it seems like for this person who wrote in, that transness and a resistance to kind of this restrictive narrative of the body is one of those options that makes sense for them. But I think that there is actually, I would align with this person in terms of their position and say, like, I think that there is some toxicity and some unhealth in this flattened dimension of humanness that is offered to girls and women in a way that they're actually forced to leave their full embodied self and the full expression of being a body as a means of complying with gendered narratives that ultimately, I mean, where do we see them take us? We see them take us towards disordered eating, body manipulation, restricted agency. Again, the corseting of the body is deeply connected to the corseting of the mind. And so I think within the gendered narratives of the feminization of and socialization of the female body, I think what happens is we get flatter humans. And then the social reward for that is, the stamp of approval in some contexts where these people who are playing the role of woman well within the constraints of what gender presentation is handed to them, that's reinforced in such a way that it feels sometimes like there isn't any other option. Like either I have to be compliant with this narrative or there's no way for me to be valuable in society. And I think it's very helpful to say, I'm not participating.
No, I mean, I thought it was a very interesting question because it's something that I had never, thought of. And I think that what you're saying and what this person wrote in their interpretation, of their lived experience, I think is a really interesting one. I'm going to switch gears a little bit to more of the questions about body image. And there were several different questions, and I tried to categorize them together so that they didn't get repetitive. But one thing that, a metaphor that I really liked is your discussion of the mirrors at the science world and the distorted mirrors and how when all mirrors are distorted, it's hard for us to recognize the distortion there. In my own work, so I work in an OCD and related disorders specialty clinic and work a lot with individuals with body dysmorphia, and I'm currently with some colleagues working on some projects for body image with adolescents and young adults. And constantly in my work, I hear teens and young adults talk about social media accounts that they follow that focus on, people going through what they eat in a given day, or people showing photos of this is me 1 minute and this is me another minute. And my understanding is that this content is intended to make the consumers of the accounts feel more comfortable, in their own skin. But from talking to people, I've started to wonder whether consumption of this is actually healthy, or if it just leads people to feel worse about themselves because they see, a social media influencer say, look at all the stuff I eat in a day. And the consumer of the social media account ends up feeling worse about themselves because they feel you can eat all of that and still maintain this physique. I can't do that. Or see, a photo of someone's version of what it's like to be bloated and feel worse about themselves because, that version of bloated still is thin to the person looking at the photo. I know that for everyone it's different, and I'm not here to bash those social media accounts, but do you have thoughts on the social media movement of this is what I eat in a day, or people who seem to be trying to recognize the body positivity that you so nicely articulate? It's virtually impossible to maintain body positivity all the time, and instead we should strive for neutrality, and whether these accounts actually seem to be helpful for people who are struggling with their own body image.
Yeah. Well, I think we're getting into some really interesting clinical territory. We think about how possible it is when we look at it through the lens of the intersection between eating disorder and disembodiment, eating disorders and disembodiment, how possible it is for a person to have disordered eating and experience a kind of fragmented attunement to their bodily cues and the inability to experience a sense of pleasure and agency in their body, but then also perceive their body as being desirable and actually have a positive body image, so to speak. So, what we can see is that body image and embodiment are separate constructs. That you could, I like to think about body image as moving into your mind to evaluate your appearance. And if you're in your mind and evaluating your appearance, right, you're evaluating it in comparison to what? Evaluation requires some sort of metric. And what we're often doing is we're pulling metrics from social media in such a way that we can evaluate ourselves against something and then say, okay, I am like this, I'm not like this, therefore, my image or my appearance is desirable or undesirable. And what I'm suggesting with embodiment is actually that we disengage from the conversation of image almost altogether to say, yeah, I think image is some part of the bodily experience for sure, but we need a bit of an overcorrection in terms of how we understand what it means to be a body, that being a body is actually not just thinking good, pleasant thoughts about our appearance, because what we know is that we might actually be using disordered and disorganized and unhealthy versions of a body
Yeah.
with which to compare ourselves. And so it's kind of limited as a construct because we're actually not images. We're living, we're breathing, we have impulses, we have wants, we have histories, we have trauma, we have joy, we have like aliveness and creative impulse and eroticism and a spark. And none of that gets captured or gets felt or known when we are restricted to seeing ourselves as images. So what I want to propose, and I think that I hope I do this well in the book, is to say, let's actually disengage from the conversation of image almost altogether, because I think body image can be kind of objectifying as a construct. Even if I have a positive body image, I'm still seeing myself as a kind of flattened version of myself. And ultimately, what I'd like people to do is come back inside of themselves. So the metaphor that I give in the book is, and you'll know this, Sarah, because you read it, but the idea of instead of living on the front lawn of our house, kind of looking at the house and going, oh, the shingles, they should look differently, and oh, it's not as nice as my neighbors, like living inside the house and lighting a fire and cooking and drawing a bath and some way of returning inside to inhabit ourselves. And what we see, and this is fascinating to look at, that the empirical research about the relationship between embodiment and body image and eating disorders shows that the more embodied we are, the less likely we are to be kind of compulsive, obsessive, restrictive as it relates to food and image and monitoring our appearance. It's almost like we're kind of redirecting all of our attention to a different slice of our humanity. And in doing so, we remember that we are more than just an image, and it kind of rehabilitates us to a more
Right.
full version of our human experience.
Yeah.
So there's that piece,
Yeah.
and then I'll just add one more. Thanks if you can, yeah, let me know. I have so much to say about this. What I will say about images and social media is that all of this research that came out around objectification theory and self-objectification, that I'm thinking of the 90s and 2000s as it was relating to um, magazines, right? I don't know how many kids are looking at magazines at the grocery store and going like, oh, like the heroin chic version of the body, like, oh, that's for me. But we're seeing a kind of even in some ways more extreme versions of altered bodies on social media. I don't believe that engaging with media is harmful unless we're doing it without
Yeah.
thinking critically, because we're consuming so many images. So even if you're looking at an account, can you be aware of like all of the things that you listed, Sarah? Like, can a person be aware of, has this person altered their image, or how is their body different than mine? Is that, whoa, like what are they saying about which bodies are ideal and what I need to do to be loved? And if we're engaging with some content, doing so critically, in a way, it kind of inoculates us against the toxicity of seeing certain kinds of disordered presentations of bodies or eating. And that we call this media literacy. Media literacy, the ability to think critically and discern the messages implicit in what we're seeing, that allows us to be able to take a step back from just kind of the passive consumption, which starts to alter our
Yeah.
perception of
And
ourselves.
and I see someone just submitted a question, wrote in saying, how do you talk to your preteen daughters as they
Okay.
begin to look at social media?
Mm. Yes. Well, I wrote a whole book about that. It's called Mothers, Daughters, and Body Image, which is not just about body image. It's mostly about embodiment, but it's about kind of these ideas. So I feel free to head over there. I wrote a whole bunch of material about that that came out of some of my graduate research. So it's
And
evidence-based work.
related to this, I mean, in the house metaphor in your book, you talk about, all of the neighbors on their lawns making comments on the appearance of your house and their house. And several people wrote in, asking about other people commenting. One person said, I'm a college student and it feels like my friends and I bond over asking each other if we look fat or complaining about feeling bloated in
Mm,
an atmosphere that is so body
mhm.
focused. And I think she means appearance focused. How do I
Like
maintain
appearance.
connection with
Yeah.
friends while
Yeah.
disengaging from toxic conversations? And on a related note, someone else said, do you have advice on how to
Yes.
respond to my mom or other people when she makes comments about other people's bodies or mine? So just, to combine those two, how do people,
Yeah.
navigate this and
Yeah.
not engage in these conversations while still, you know,
Hmm. Mm.
maintaining
Hmm.
relationships with people who are so focused on appearance?
Yes. Well, it reminds me of, in some ways, of the question around transness too, and looking at the some of the toxicity in the way that we're socialized into girlhood and womanhood, which is, I'm going to bond by degrading myself. I'm going to create social connection with you by devaluing my body as a means of being non-threatening to you, non-competitive, but also creating closeness around the things that feel painful for me. And what I found, this actually came up in my graduate research too, about women loving their bodies, which is the subject of my first book, is that we don't really have a social script for what to do when we are in attuned connection with our bodies and we feel kind towards our appearance and we feel kind towards all of the other bodily cues that we have, that we're kind of like off the map socially, to speak. And sometimes women find that as they're talking well about themselves as a body, that people in their social spheres don't actually know what to do with that. And so there is a kind of loss of connection that can come up. And it's important to validate that as a real phenomenon that occurs, that, as you say, hey, I'm not going to participate in that, or like, hey, I feel differently, or please don't say that. Sometimes people who are really deeply entrenched in dieting mindsets or disembodiment or disconnection from their bodily cues and or bodily control feel like they don't, if this is our means of being close, I don't know how to be close with you now. So we want to recognize that that's a tricky piece to navigate, given that, social connection is so essential for our belonging and survival and satisfaction in life. But what I do think that we can say, all the way from, nothing and passive redirecting of the conversation, is, this, I borrow this from the Gottman's work and also kind of the nonviolent communication, but like, hey, when you say this, when you say that, like, oh, here's what happens in me, I feel sad. And what happens is it makes me feel like I have to hate my body to be connected to you. And I don't want that. What I'd love is if, I'd love if you could help me and I could help you by shifting the conversations away from that way of connecting. And there is something to be said for how I think that within us, deep within each of us, is a desire to be connected and to help and be, to be a valuable, source of connection and hope for the people that we love in our lives. And so we can kind of appeal to that sometimes when we provide feedback to someone by saying, I need help with something. I'm realizing that the stories I'm telling myself about what is an ideal body really keep me stuck in a restricted way of acting and thinking, I'm upset, maybe no one would use that language except for me because that's the, the clinical language, but we might say something like, I'm just noticing I'm focusing so much on dieting and calorie counting. And it ends up making me feel miserable because I'm just like obsessing about the calories and I'm not thinking about like if I enjoy the food or not. And so we might say to a person then, like, could you help me? like, I trust you. I feel like I need your help with this. Do you think that could we try to focus on what feels good about being a body? Could we try to focus on like what feels pleasurable or what's going right? Because I think I need your help to do that. So there's everything from the nonviolent approach to say, hey, it hurts me when you do
Yeah.
that, all the way to, could I have your help? And I think that goes from, peers to parents. There is something really important about being able to say to our parents, I need your help and I want your help and I want to feel good in my skin. And I know you want me to feel good in my skin too. Because I'm assuming that almost every parent on the planet out there wants their kid to feel satisfied with who they are and wants to feel a sense of ease and gentleness inside of their own experience. So you can appeal to that with your parents and say, hey, it hurts me when you say this, but I need your help and I want to shift the conversation. And there's interesting all the way to, depending on what kind of relationship you have with your parents. I mean, I wouldn't recommend this to a client. I wouldn't say this as like a clinical strategy, but I was pregnant. Someone in my family came up and grabbed my tummy. And I remember in that moment, my instinctive response, which I think was a lot more online when I was pregnant, I felt just a little bit spicier and fire than I normally do. I just grabbed their tummy right back and I said, oh, is that what we do now? You just grab my stomach and I grab yours, and I like grab the person kind of by their skin. And I said, don't touch my body without my permission ever again,
Yeah.
because I bet you didn't like it when I touched yours. And like that ended the conversation. So, I mean, mind you, again, probably wouldn't recommend it. There are probably much more effective strategies, but sometimes we have a moment of saying like, don't, no, you can't. And I think
Yeah. And I
that
think
there's value in that.
like boundary setting can be scary. But I think, and I don't want to make this a global statement in any way, but often people might, not everyone, but some people might respond better to boundaries than someone might expect. So when there's almost like a co-rumination about
Yes.
appearance, that the second one person sets a boundary, other people might
Yeah.
be relieved because often I think there's a cycle of feeling pressure
Yes.
to engage in the conversation, even if everyone there knows that it's not beneficial.
Exactly. Right. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. It's interesting that you say that, because I was thinking about it from the perspective of, okay, how do I liberate myself? But you're right. Like, because there's a social connection piece, like, who knows what we might be inviting another person into in terms of a new way of thinking about themselves or behaving when we, if we unhook ourselves from that dynamic, we might set them free too.
Um,
Thanks for adding that piece.
One question before I want to transition into talking about trauma, but one question that someone wrote in with was if you had any thoughts on the impact of autism and neurodivergence on advice in your book, particularly regarding interoception.
Yeah. What I know from different folks, not to make a sweeping statement about all folks within the neurodiversity community, but is that interoception can be harder to access. And so it can take more work, and sometimes more specific physiological cues can be helpful. So I'm more likely to use things like a tuning fork, or to help a person touch their body, or to create some sensation in some way to generate, do use exercises to create sensation interoceptively that becomes a little bit more obvious or easier to work with. But I would say that, um, as with any person, we come to the experience of being a body with varying degrees of resources and practice and limitation. I mean, with this is not technically within the community of neurodiversity, but alexithymia I think of as being similar in terms of like just the inability to feel and be in relationship with feelings and identify them. And so depending on how we're coming at this work, we just might need more time and more support, and we might need more patience internally for ourselves as we learn how to build the interoceptive cues and capacities. But what is fascinating, and I've seen some of the preliminary evidence around this, is sometimes the use of psychedelic psychotherapy can be really helpful for individuals who would otherwise be misattuned or unable to, or highly dissociated from their bodies and their bodily states, as a means of increasing sensation and really turning the dial up on interoception to feel to feel something and kind of build the pathway of the language that the body
Yeah.
speaks in that
And
way.
and I guess you know, talking about dissociating and um, trying to transition into talking about trauma with relation to that for people who dissociate due to trauma, how can people practice embodiment while I'm not going to articulate this well, but while struggling with dissociation due
Mm.
to trauma?
Yeah. So when we look at what embodiment is, again, I mentioned a few of these, but there, there's the one slice of it, the positive one slice of positive embodiment that we think about, which is attuned self-care. So the ability to sense and notice and respond to our bodily cues. And that can be harder when we're dissociating, but we can also exercise agency as a means of embodiment. So even though we might not feel something interoceptively in a way that can be very difficult when we are experiencing dissociation, we can say
Yeah.
no to things that would feel overwhelming to us, that we know would create a trauma response that we're not ready to tolerate. We can say no as a means of protecting ourselves. We can engage in exercises that are meant to be regulatory and help break through some of the dissociation, grounding strategies, somatic practices. Like, what I think that we misunderstand about embodiment when we get into it a little bit deeper is that we misunderstand that simply the wanting to be in connection with our bodies
Yeah.
is a function of positive embodiment, even if we are misattuned or dissociated. Like, I think it is possible to feel dissociation and to be aware that that's happening and go, okay, how can I care for my bodily self right now? Like, what is available to me in my environment? What kind of behaviors? Like, that is also embodied practice, not
Yeah.
just perfect attunement, not just a sense of total pleasure and command over that. The other thing I'll say that I think is really interesting in the conversation about dissociation, and I'm not hearing spoken about in lots of places, is how important it is to associate to the dissociation. So dissociation in itself is very, very, very hard
Right.
to feel because the nature of it is that it's not feeling. And yet, for most of us, and I would say that this is in my own experience and having done my own trauma work as well, when we get enough practice being outside of dissociative states and inside of dissociative states, we can start to feel the transition in and out happening. You have to be paying attention, and it is slow and subtle, but you can actually feel it. And sometimes the feeling of it is shutting down, there's a temperature change, there's a numbness, there's a tingling. All of a sudden, we're not feeling our body, and we can be aware that we're not feeling our body. And I would say that simply trying to associate to the dissociation is an embodied practice. You don't have to have all sensation online to be, kind of air quotes, perfectly embodied and attuned. What I want to suggest is that there's this wide and very generous definition of embodiment that allows for us to be wanting to connect or feeling how much we don't want to connect as a part of our embodied
No, and I think
experience.
that that's so important. And I think too, as hard as it may be, it's so much easier said than done, but having compassion for what our body is and isn't able to feel in
Mm-hmm.
the moment, whether that be due to physical limitations from an injury or um, whether it be due to the impacts of trauma and dissociating, having compassion rather than responding solely with frustration toward oneself about what one can't do in that moment.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe even like if
Yeah,
compassion can be hard, simply noticing, simply being aware, like pulling it back. Because I'm very aware that especially in complex trauma presentations with, there not having been very many visible examples growing up of what compassionate, attuned responding looks like, just
yeah,
being aware that you exist and aware that you are a body, like
yeah. And
might be the
someone
starting
wrote in
spot.
asking for clarification on the difference between body dissociation and body neutrality. Would you mind quickly explaining the difference there?
Body dissociation, body neutrality. I would say that so body neutrality seems to be a social movement that's happening, which positions us as trying to have fewer appearance-based comments and conversations and allowing a person to be able to experience life without so much preoccupation with image. That is different than what we might call, a dissociative or disconnected or disembodied experience. That is, it's almost like I
Yeah.
can't even position them on two poles because they're kind of like in separate conversations altogether. But what we might say is disembodiment or dissociation would be all the way from kind of hatred towards our appearance to not sensing our body, misattunement to cues, harming our body, lack of agency, lack of felt sense of selfness as a body. I'm thinking about all of the other clinical language, but maybe a more helpful way of talking about it is like thinking of ourselves as being a head that's carried around by kind of the substance of
Right.
a body, but the body isn't us. Like the body is just this, it's a thing. And maybe we don't even aren't aware of the thing. Maybe we don't even care about the thing. Maybe we're trying to constrict or control or manage the thing, but the thing is essentially not us. And by contrast, embodiment would be our way of saying, oh no, the body is us and shapes what it means to be a self.
Right.
The body is actually the place where our self exists.
Um, Someone or a couple of people actually wrote in um, asking for advice on learning your body is good when it's constantly reminded of trauma. So whether, you're constantly in the place in which you've endured trauma or have
Mm-hmm.
reminders and someone else, and either we can address these separately or together, asked how do you balance the need for connection to others with physical safety after some kind of abuse or assault? Yeah, sorry.
Mm-hmm. Can you remind me of the first
How
question?
do you
It was
learn your body
about,
is
yeah,
good when
that's
it's
okay.
constantly reminded you of trauma?
Uh, yeah. I think let's step back and instead of thinking about good, let's just think about the functionality of it. Like, so understanding the neurobiology of the traumatic stress response has really helped me because I've understood that even the reminders of trauma are our body trying to say to our community, to our awareness, like there's some unfinished business here. Like you are hurt and something needs attention. And it reminds me, I often use the analogy of, um, you know, if you've ever had this experience of getting a parking ticket and then you pay it, but you pay it right, while the reminder is already in the mail.
Yeah.
And so you paid it, but you get this notice in the mail saying, hey, there's an unpaid parking ticket. I think of these like reminders or flashbacks or body memories as kind of being like the system hasn't gotten updated yet. And our body is saying, sorry about that. This is not this is not finished. This is still ongoing. You need to address this. You need to give this some attention. And that is not to punish us. That is to say, like, there's this needs healing, right? This needs attention. So even the understanding that that's how our bodies are wired, such that we can move towards integration and healing, and there's kind of this automatic reminder system that is meant to highlight for us, something needs care. Like to me, that feels like part of our survival mechanisms, part of our goodness, part of our innate wiring to move us towards integration. Mind you, if we don't understand trauma and we don't have the resources around us and we can't get to therapy because the wait lists are long and we were never told that a flashback is actually our body saying, hey, can you work on this? Can you heal this? It's unfinished. We might have all of these sensations and think, look, it's proof. It's proof that our bodies are bad,
Yeah.
that we can't trust ourselves. And simply having information, right? This is where I think the psychoed is really important around trauma. It can help us neutralize some of that intensity and go, oh, what's happening is a very normal
Yeah.
thing that all bodies do when they've been
Yeah.
through trauma like mine.
And, you know,
Mm.
to address part of the second question about balancing the need for connection to others, and I'm going to alter it a little bit instead of saying after abuse or assault, just saying, how do you balance the need for connection to others while still processing the trauma? Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's such an individual and phenomenological question. I almost feel like reluctant to answer it because there's some people where, you know, the abuse was physical or the trauma was physical. And so physical contact feels terrifying. Or for other people, it's like medicine to get physical touch and go, oh, this is what safe touch is like. Or for other people, you know, if the abuse was physical in some way or altered a body boundary, being able to be in proximity to someone and have them not try to make any kind of physical contact at all is like, oh, relieving to know that that boundary would be held. And so maybe the answer to the question is you get to decide. You get to decide and finding ways, like trying different kinds of connection in different conditions with different people who you have different relationships with will, I think, create some data for you. And sometimes the first time we try something, we are met with a fear response that doesn't necessarily tell us like this is dangerous. It might tell us, oh, this is new and this is different. So sometimes trying something that we know is safe, even if our body doesn't feel like it's safe, and trying that a few times again, in a context where there's lots of agency and our boundaries are respected, I think that that can help us experiment with kinds of connection. I'm just thinking about even eye contact for some folks, right? Or sitting next to a person on a bench and just being a little closer than they would like to be typically, but going, oh yeah, this is a person who I can trust to keep my boundaries. All the way to, I've been in situations with someone where the thing that they needed was to know that they could say no to me as many times as they needed to. And I wouldn't punish them. I wouldn't be distressed. I wouldn't make it, you know, turn it into a thing that ruptured our attachment, so they could be in connection and also practice having the boundaries they never got. So I think connection and what we need based on our trauma history is so specific to each individual, that being able to like pay attention, figure it out, have someone you can have those conversations with.
And I think
like
those
that's the
conversations
next step.
are so important. And I think a lot of people, you know,
Mm.
especially if the trauma is due to some kind of abuse or assault, understandably feel worried about opening up about it and how, you know, someone else might respond. But that
Mm-hmm.
if someone feels physically and emotionally safe, you know, having those conversations, I think, is so important, so that in the moment they can set boundaries, say what they want, what they don't want, what feels good, and realize that on some days they might want more connection than others, and that that it's not linear, and that
Mm-hmm.
that's okay.
Yes,
You know, and
absolutely. Yeah, well
it's
articulated.
interesting because as diverse as the books that we've read have been, trauma comes up in so many of them because it's so pervasive. And in a prior book club discussion, we
Mm-hmm.
were talking about how instead of trying to move on from trauma, instead trying to reorient it to moving on with it. That this idea of trying to move on from something that has been so
Mm-hmm.
deeply ingrained, and who you are in your experience, and for so many people has informed who they are,
Mm-hmm.
puts, you know, an
Yeah.
unrealistic and unfair pressure on themselves, and instead trying to move on with it, you know, with that
Mm-hmm.
experience, and try to feel,
Yes.
you know, that they can be whole again,
Yeah.
you know, not necessarily despite, but in light of what they've experienced. I think it's an important reframe.
Right. Right.
You know, I'm
Absolutely.
mindful of time here, but I want to provide you the opportunity to talk about you know, your other book, and you know, other ways that
Oh,
people
thanks.
can consume and enjoy
Mm.
the immense, you know, knowledge that you espouse, and the gift you give to all of us
Oh,
of explaining it so kindly and so
thank
articulately.
you. Thank, thank you so much, Sarah. So I have a book coming out. I haven't released it
Wow.
publicly. I guess this will be the first time I talk about it. A book coming out in January 2024, which I think is called Practices for Embodied Living, which will be about taking the things that we talked about in the book and actually fleshing out more exercises and practices. And those would be things that you could do as a group, or things you could do for self-reflection, or that you could do, as experiments, rituals in some way of reconnecting with yourself as a body. So that will be coming out, available January 2024. So keep an eye out for an announcement around that. I have a couple other books. There is Embodiment and Eating Disorder, which is an edited textbook, which, let's be honest, the average population is not going to read. It's like
Yeah.
very research, empirical, clinically minded. But if you like to geek out about stuff like that, embodiment and eating disorders, you can have a look at that. And then my first book, which was Mothers, Daughters, and Body Image: Learning to Love Ourselves as We Are, which looks at the messages we pass between us as women about our bodies, and how we can shift the narratives collectively about what it means to be in connection and what it means to be a body. So you can check those out. And then there's, social media and events that I do, and my website at HillaryLMcBride.com. So you can check all those things.
And then two final questions that are pretty quick. The first is, are you reading anything interesting right now that you would suggest other people check out besides your own work?
Oh, yes. Okay, where is it? Yeah, I'll grab it for you because it's such a beautiful and interesting cover. I'm reading this, Psychedelics and Psychotherapy, which is an edited text, because that's a big part of my work too. And what else am I reading on my stack here? I just picked up Finding the Mother Tree because I'm really interested in matrescence and nature. And there might be a project coming on matrescence and nature. So I'm reading Finding the Mother Tree.
Very cool. And then last quick question is, you talk about the importance of movement, and you talk about your own experience with going to dance classes and, putting yourself out there. Any quick advice for someone who wants to follow your lead but feels nervous to put themselves out there?
Yeah. Just put some music on when you're cooking, put some music on when you have a free moment, and see what your body wants to do. Think of it as like the music is like a question and your body gets to respond. And sometimes it just feels good to like move our hips a little bit as we're like stirring some soup. And other times it feels good to like really get down and bend those knees and stretch it out and feel like we can express ourselves or shake a little bit. So I don't think it has to be so technical or so foreign. Like most of us respond well to music. That's not the case for everybody, but just putting on something that makes us feel good, and even noticing how we feel and what good feelings feel like.
Well, thank you so much. Your work is so important, and I think it's something that everyone should be reading. And thank you for sharing your gift and your vulnerability of talking about your own experiences with all of us. I so appreciate it.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for this conversation and the invitation. And thank you to everybody who's joined us today and read the book as part of the book club. I really appreciate your engagement, thoughtful engagement, your reflection, your sharing. It means a lot to me that it's out in the world and it's reaching you.
I hope you have a wonderful night and a great rest of your week. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, Sarah. Bye, everyone.